On the morning of September 1st, 1859, a British astronomer named Richard Carrington settled himself at his telescope in his private observatory in Redhill, Surrey, and began what he expected to be an ordinary session of observing the sun. Carrington was 26 years old, methodical, and passionate about solar astronomy, at a time when it was still a relatively young discipline. He had been systematically tracking sunspots for several years, making careful drawings of their positions and sizes as they appeared and moved across the solar disk. Sunspots had been observed since Galileo, but nobody had yet explained what they were or what caused them. Carrington had hoped that his years of patient observation might eventually reveal some pattern in their behaviour. On this particular Thursday morning, the sun was showing an unusually active region. A large complex of sunspots was visible, and Carrington had been carefully sketching their arrangement. The session was proceeding exactly as hundreds of previous sessions had proceeded. And then, at precisely 11 minutes and 18 seconds past 11 o'clock in the morning, something happened that Richard Carrington had never seen before, and that no human being had ever documented. 2 points of intensely white light erupted from within the sunspot group. Carrington later described them as 2 patches of intensely bright and white light that broke out. The lights were so brilliant that they seemed to outshine even the brilliance of the photosphere around them. He immediately ran to fetch another observer to confirm what he was seeing, aware that what he was witnessing was extraordinary. By the time he returned barely a minute later, the lights had already faded substantially. He watched them diminish over the following minutes until they were gone. He had just witnessed the first solar flare ever recorded by a human being. He did not know that. He knew only that something unusual had happened on the surface of the sun, and he wrote it up carefully for the Royal Astronomical Society. Another British astronomer, Richard Hodgson, had independently observed the same event from a different location and would also report it, providing independent confirmation. What neither Carrington nor Hodgson knew in those moments was that the event they had just witnessed was the beginning of something far larger than a brief light on the solar surface. The flare they had observed was the visible signature of an explosion on the sun of almost incomprehensible energy, and what that explosion had thrown into space, a vast cloud of magnetized plasma travelling at millions of kilometers per hour directly toward Earth, would arrive within 17.5 hours. When it arrived, the world changed. Not permanently, not catastrophically, given the technology of 1859, but dramatically enough that accounts from around the world would describe the same night with the same words: extraordinary, unprecedented, terrifying, and beautiful. It was beautiful because the night sky, on the evening of September 1st and into September 2nd, lit up with auroras visible across the entire planet. The northern lights, normally confined to the high latitudes near the Arctic, cascaded southward until they were visible over Cuba, over Jamaica, over Hawaii. They were visible over Colombia, nearly at the equator. In the Rocky Mountains of North America, gold prospectors camped in the wilderness woke in the night convinced that the sun had risen early. The sky was so brilliantly lit. In Rome, citizens gathered in the streets to watch the southern sky erupt in curtains of crimson and green light. In Boston, it was reportedly possible to read a newspaper by aurora light at midnight. In Australia, the auroras were so intense that confused roosters began to crow, convinced that dawn had come. The beauty was not the danger. The danger was invisible, measured not in light but in the electricity. The telegraph was the internet of 1859. The network of copper wires strung on wooden poles that connected the cities and towns of the industrialized world was the circulatory system of modern commerce and communication. News travelled by telegraph. Financial markets operated by telegraph. Governments communicated by telegraph. And on the night of September 1st to 2nd, 1859, the telegraph system of the entire world simultaneously went insane. Operators across North America and Europe reported that their equipment began to behave in ways that were simply impossible under any operating conditions they understood. Instruments that should have remained still were deflecting wildly. Messages were transmitting on their own, spontaneously, without any operator sending them. Some equipment began sparking and producing arcs of electricity. Telegraph paper caught fire in several stations. Operators received electric shocks from equipment that should have had no charge. And in one of the most remarkable documented episodes of the entire event, some telegraph lines in the northeastern United States were found to be transmitting messages perfectly, without any battery power at all, operating entirely on the geomagnetic currents flowing through the copper wires from the storm above. 2 telegraph operators in Boston and Portland, Maine, attempted an experiment. They disconnected their batteries entirely, relying purely on the geomagnetic current, and managed to send and receive messages for 2 hours using only the electricity delivered directly by the solar storm. The Carrington Event, as this episode would eventually come to be named in honour of the astronomer who first documented its solar origin, was the largest geomagnetic storm ever recorded in the instrumental era. The compass needles that observatories around the world were continuously recording swung so far that the measuring instruments at several stations, including the famous Kew Observatory in London, went completely off the scale. At the Colaba Observatory in Bombay, India, the instruments recorded a horizontal component deflection of approximately 1600 nanotesla. Modern researchers attempting to estimate what this translates to in terms of the current standard measure of geomagnetic storm intensity, the DST index, have arrived at estimates ranging from approximately 850 nanotesla to as high as 1700 nanotesla. To give these numbers context, the most severe geomagnetic storms of the modern era typically record DST values of -200 to -300 nanotesla. The Carrington Event was, by the most conservative modern estimates, approximately 3 to 4 times more powerful than any storm we have measured in the age of modern instrumentation. By some estimates, considerably more. The world of 1859 survived the Carrington Event as well as it did for one reason only. The technology of 1859 was primitive enough that the worst the storm could do was set some telegraph paper on fire, give some operators electric shocks, and render the global telegraph network inoperable for a day or 2. When the storm passed and the planet's magnetic field returned to normal, the telegraph system was restored and business resumed. The technology of the 21st century is not so resilient. To understand why a Carrington-scale event today would be categorically different in its consequences from the Carrington Event of 1859, we need to understand both how the sun produces these events and how the modern world has made itself vulnerable to them. The sun is a star of approximately average size and luminosity, approximately 4.5 billion years old, and approximately halfway through its expected main sequence lifetime. At its core, hydrogen nuclei are continuously fusing to form helium, releasing energy that takes tens of thousands of years to reach the solar surface and then approximately 8 minutes to travel to Earth. The Sun radiates energy in all wavelengths of the electromagnetic spectrum, from radio waves through visible light to X-rays and gamma rays. But the Sun does not radiate uniformly or steadily. It is a dynamic, violent environment of turbulent plasma and enormously complex magnetic fields. The Sun's surface, called the photosphere, is continuously churning with convection cells, each approximately the size of a large country, that bring hot plasma up from below, radiate heat, cool, and sink again. The Sun's rotation, which is not uniform because the Sun is not a solid body, generates complex magnetic fields that thread through the plasma and can interact in complicated and sometimes explosive ways. Sunspots are regions of intense concentrated magnetic field on the solar surface. The magnetic field in a sunspot is so strong that it partially suppresses the convection that brings heat to the surface, making sunspots cooler and therefore darker than the surrounding photosphere. Despite being cooler than their surroundings, the larger sunspots are still thousands of degrees Celsius. They appear dark only by contrast with the even brighter surface around them. The Sun's magnetic activity is not constant. It varies on an approximately 11-year cycle, the solar cycle, during which the number of sunspots and the general level of solar activity rises to a maximum and then falls to a minimum. During solar maximum, the Sun's magnetic field is most complex and most energetic, and the probability of energetic events is highest. During solar minimum, activity drops to its lowest level. The specific events that pose the most significant threat to Earth are solar flares and coronal mass ejections, often abbreviated as CMEs. These are related but distinct phenomena. A solar flare is an intense burst of radiation, primarily in X-rays and ultraviolet wavelengths, that can affect Earth's upper atmosphere within 8 minutes of the flare because radiation travels at the speed of light. A coronal mass ejection is a physical eruption, a cloud of billions of tons of magnetized plasma that is launched from the solar corona and travels outward through the solar system at speeds ranging from a few hundred to several thousand kilometers per second. Not all CMEs are directed at Earth. The Sun produces many CMEs in every direction during active periods, and only those aimed directly at Earth pose a threat. When a CME is aimed at Earth, the time from launch to arrival at Earth depends on its speed. The typical travel time is 2 to 3 days. The Carrington Event CME arrived in approximately 17.5 hours, making it one of the fastest ever recorded. The reason it travelled so quickly was that an earlier CME, ejected approximately 18 hours before the main Carrington Event, had cleared a path through the solar wind by sweeping aside the normal plasma that would otherwise have slowed the main ejection. This compounding of events, an initial CME clearing the path for a faster, more powerful one, is one of the most dangerous scenarios in space weather. When a CME reaches Earth, it first encounters the planet's magnetic field, the magnetosphere. The magnetosphere is a vast invisible shield that deflects most of the solar wind around the planet. Under normal solar wind conditions, the magnetosphere maintains a relatively stable shape, compressed on the sun-facing side and elongated on the night side. When a CME strikes, the magnetosphere is compressed dramatically on the day side and then stretched and distorted as the CME's magnetic fields interact with Earth's own field. The critical factor in how damaging a CME is to Earth depends significantly on the orientation of its magnetic field. The the CME carries its own magnetic field embedded within it, and if that field is oriented southward, anti-parallel to Earth's northward point in field at the equator, the two fields can reconnect. This process, called magnetic reconnection, allows the CME's energy to couple directly into Earth's magnetosphere and drive electric currents in the ionosphere, the upper atmosphere, and on the ground. These ground-level electric currents, called geomagnetically induced currents or GICs, flow through any long conductor on the surface of the planet. In 1859, the main long conductors were the telegraph wires. In the 21st century, the main long conductors are the transmission lines of the electrical grid, and the consequences of GICs flowing through modern electrical infrastructure are categorically different from anything that happened in 1859. The infrastructure of modern civilization can be described in a single word: electrical. Everything that maintains the world we live in, the water that comes from taps, the food in refrigerators, the fuel at gas stations, the money in bank accounts, the internet, the phones, the medical equipment, the climate control, the transportation systems, the financial markets, the communications networks. All of it depends, at root, on electricity. The electrical grid is not just one system among many modern systems. It is the system on which all other systems depend. The modern electrical grid is one of the most complex machines ever built by human beings. It consists of generating stations of various types, connected by transmission lines that carry electricity at extremely high voltages across vast distances, stepping down through a cascade of transformers to the distribution level voltages that reach homes and businesses. The transmission grid operates at voltages ranging from approximately 100,000 to over 1 million volts, because transmitting power at high voltage over long distances requires less energy loss than transmitting at lower voltages. The components that make the grid vulnerable to geomagnetic storms are the large high-voltage transformers that convert electricity from transmission voltages to distribution voltages. These transformers are the critical nexus points of the grid. A modern large high-voltage transformer, known as an EHV transformer, is a remarkable piece of engineering. It consists of vast coils of copper wire wound around a core of specialized steel laminations designed to transfer electrical energy from one voltage level to another with minimal losses. What makes these transformers catastrophically vulnerable to GICs is their design. High-voltage transformers are designed to handle alternating current, which in North America and most of the Western Hemisphere oscillates at 60 cycles per second. The GICs induced by a geomagnetic storm are not alternating current. They are quasi-direct current, meaning they flow in essentially one direction for extended periods. When DC flows through a transformer designed for AC, it causes a process called magnetic saturation. The iron core of the transformer becomes magnetically saturated, meaning it loses its ability to efficiently transfer magnetic flux. The result is that the transformer begins to draw enormous amounts of reactive power from the grid, it generates intense internal heat, and it can experience structural damage to its core and windings from the combination of heating and vibration. The specific danger is that a sufficiently large GIC can permanently destroy a large high-voltage transformer, not just trip it offline, not just cause it to malfunction temporarily. Destroy it permanently. The internal windings can melt. The insulating oil can overheat and cause fire. The structural integrity of the core can be compromised. And when a large high-voltage transformer is destroyed, it cannot simply be replaced quickly. Large high-voltage transformers are custom manufactured, essentially built to order for specific applications. The largest transformers can weigh between 400 and 800 tons and must be transported on specialized heavy rail cars. Manufacturing lead times for large power transformers are typically 12 to 18 months under normal conditions. The global manufacturing capacity for these components is limited, and in a scenario where a Carrington-scale geomagnetic storm destroys a significant percentage of the large transformers in North America, Europe, or Asia simultaneously, the manufacturing capacity available to replace them would be nowhere near adequate to restore power within any timeline that could prevent cascading social collapse. The United States has approximately 2,000 large high-voltage transformers. If a Carrington-scale event destroyed even a fraction of these, the affected regions could face power outages lasting not hours or days, but months or years. A 2008 report by the National Academy of Sciences estimated that a severe geomagnetic storm similar to the Carrington event could destroy between 300 and 350 extra high-voltage transformers in the continental United States, potentially leaving 100 to 130 million people without power. The Academy estimated that recovery could take 4 to 10 years. 4 to 10 years without power. Let us think carefully about what that means. Let us begin by taking you through what actually happens, not in abstract economic terms, but in the specific physical reality of a Carrington-scale geomagnetic storm hitting the modern world. Hour by hour, day by day, the warning arrives. The Deep Space Climate Observatory, a spacecraft maintained by NOAA at the Lagrange, one point approximately 1 million miles from Earth, detects an incoming CME and transmits its measurements to NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado. Based on the measurements, forecasters determine that an extremely large and fast-moving CME is inbound, with arrival estimated within 15 to 45 minutes. This is not much warning. 15 to 45 minutes is not enough time to perform a controlled shutdown of the grid, which would take hours to accomplish safely. It is not enough time to move most satellites into protective orientations. It is barely enough time to transmit warnings to grid operators and satellite managers. Some protective actions can be taken. Some grid operators can temporarily reduce the loading on vulnerable transformers. Some satellites can execute protective procedures, but the window is desperately small. The CME arrives. It hits the magnetosphere. The magnetosphere compresses. Within minutes, geomagnetically induced currents begin flowing through power transmission lines across the affected hemisphere. Grid operators see unusual readings on their monitoring systems. Reactive power flows become erratic. Some protection systems at substations begin to trip, taking portions of the grid offline as a defensive measure. Transformers in some areas begin to overheat. Within the first hour, power outages begin cascading across large areas. When a substation trips offline, the power it was handling redistributes across adjacent lines. Those lines become overloaded. Their protection systems trip. More power redistributes. The cascade propagates faster than human operators can respond. Within minutes, entire grid regions can go dark. The experience for most people is simple. The lights go out. Every electrical device in the home stops functioning. Immediately after the outage begins, the battery-powered devices continue. Phones, laptop computers, some lights. Emergency generators at hospitals, data centers, and other critical facilities start automatically. Traffic signals go dark. The streets outside take on an unusual quality that most people in the developed world have never experienced. Complete darkness, not interrupted by any artificial light. At this moment, most people are not alarmed. Power outages happen. They expect power to be restored within hours. They check their phones and see that cell service is still working, though sporadic. They try to find information about what has happened. The early reports are confusing, something solar, something unusual. Officials are saying they are assessing the situation. What the officials know and what is not yet being communicated publicly is that the transformers are being damaged. Not all of them. Not everywhere equally. The most vulnerable transformers, those in areas with geology that conducts GICs most efficiently, in areas where the storm's currents are flowing most intensely, are being permanently damaged. Some have already failed. At several substations, fires have broken out in the transformer oil. Emergency services are overwhelmed. Within the first 24 hours, the dimensions of the disaster become clearer. Power has not been restored in the most heavily affected areas, and it will not be restored for a very long time. The transformers that have been destroyed cannot be replaced in weeks or months. The regions without power are beginning to realize that this is not an ordinary outage. The cascade of consequences from extended power loss in a modern society is almost impossible to overstate. Consider the following. Water. Modern municipal water systems use electric pumps to maintain pressure throughout the distribution network. When those pumps stop, water pressure in the network begins to drop within hours. Without pressure, water does not flow from taps above the ground floor. Within 24 to 48 hours, water pressure in most areas without power has dropped to zero. Toilets cannot be flushed. Drinking water is not available. Hospitals have critical water needs that cannot be met by stored supplies beyond a day or two. Food. Refrigerators and freezers stop working the moment power fails. Food stored in them remains safe for 4 to 6 hours in a typical residential refrigerator, 2 to 4 days in a full freezer if the door is kept closed. After that, it spoils. Supermarkets, whose entire inventory depends on refrigeration for most of the perishable food categories that make up the majority of the modern diet, face complete loss of inventory within days. The just-in-time supply chains that restock supermarket shelves also depend on refrigerated transport and on electronic ordering and logistic systems. The average American city contains approximately 3 to 5 days of food in its retail inventory. After that, there is no more food available for distribution unless alternative supply chains can be established, which requires functional transportation infrastructure, which requires fuel, which requires fuel. Every gas station in the country uses electric pumps to move fuel from underground storage tanks to the pump handle. Without electricity, those pumps do not work. The fuel is physically present underground but inaccessible. Emergency vehicles, including fire trucks, ambulances, and police cars, have their own fuel stores, but these are typically measured in days, not weeks. When those stores are exhausted, emergency services stop. Communications. The internet and cellular phone networks depend on electrical power. Cell towers have battery backup systems that typically last 4 to 8 hours. Data centers have more substantial backup power, typically diesel generators, but those require fuel. Within hours to days after power fails, most communications infrastructure in the affected areas has also failed. The internet, which the modern world uses for everything from financial transactions to supply chain management to emergency coordination, goes dark in the affected regions: finance. The modern financial system is entirely digital. Every bank account balance, every credit card transaction, every stock trade exists as an entry in a computer system somewhere. Those computer systems depend on power. While the underlying data may be backed up in multiple locations and may survive even a severe storm, the ability to access and use that data depends on functioning communications infrastructure and on functional devices to connect to that infrastructure. In an extended power outage, the financial system effectively ceases to function for the affected population. Healthcare. Hospitals have backup generators and are designed to function during power outages. But backup generators require fuel. A hospital consuming its normal amount of electricity needs approximately 5,000 to 10,000 gallons of diesel fuel per day to run its generators. Most hospitals maintain enough stored fuel to run generators for 3 to 7 days. After that, without resupply, the generators stop. Without power, modern medical equipment does not function. Ventilators stop. Dialysis machines stop. Infusion pumps stop. Operating rooms cannot function. ICU monitoring ceases. The consequences for critically ill patients are immediate and severe. In a large-scale power outage lasting weeks, the mortality among people who require continuous medical support to survive could be substantial. This is the specific reality that a Carrington-scale geomagnetic storm would impose on the modern world. Not the abstract economic loss estimates of trillions of dollars. The specific physical reality of no water, no food, no fuel, no communications, no functioning financial system, and degraded medical care for a population that has built its entire civilization on the assumption that these systems will always be available. If you're finding this important, please subscribe and leave a like. Leave a comment telling me where in the world you are and what time it is. I always read them. Now let us continue. The question many people ask at this point is whether we have any experience with what a significant geomagnetic storm does to modern infrastructure. The answer is yes. We have several data points from the recent past, and they are informative precisely because they represent storms substantially smaller than the Carrington event. The most instructive modern example occurred on March 13th, 1989. A series of solar flares and CMEs had been erupting from the Sun during the preceding week, and on March 13th, the largest of the associated geomagnetic storms arrived at Earth. The storm was rated at Kp equals 9, the maximum on the standard scale, and it was one of the most powerful geomagnetic events measured in the modern instrumental era. The storm was not a Carrington event. By most estimates, it was perhaps 1/3 to 1/2 as powerful as the Carrington event in terms of its overall energy input to the magnetosphere. It was serious, but it was not the worst case, and what it did to the electrical infrastructure of one Canadian province provides the most concrete available evidence for what a full Carrington event would do to modern grid infrastructure. Hydro-Quebec is the Crown Corporation responsible for the generation and transmission of electricity in the province of Quebec. On March 13th, 1989, at approximately 2:44 in the morning local time, the geomagnetically induced currents from the storm began flowing through Hydro-Quebec's transmission system. The system's protection relays, designed to detect unusual current flows and prevent damage to equipment, began responding to the anomalous readings. Within 92 seconds, in a cascade that unfolded faster than any human operator could respond, the entire Hydro-Quebec grid collapsed. 6 million people lost electrical power. They lost it in the early morning hours of a Canadian winter, when outdoor temperatures in many areas were well below freezing. Most would be without power for 9 hours, though some areas were not fully restored for several days. The grid collapsed because the protection systems did exactly what they were designed to do. They detected unusual conditions and tripped offline to prevent equipment damage. But the near-simultaneous tripping of so many protective elements overwhelmed the system's ability to redistribute power, and the cascade became self-sustaining. The entire province's grid went from normal operation to complete blackout in a minute and a half. The United States narrowly avoided a similar fate. Several US utilities in New England and the mid-Atlantic states reported unusual conditions on their systems during the same storm, and at least one large transformer in the northeastern United States sustained permanent damage. The overall impact on the US grid was limited partly by luck and partly by protective actions that some utilities were able to take. The damage assessment from the 1989 Quebec storm was sobering, even though the grid was restored within hours in most areas. Several large transformers were damaged, with some requiring extended repair periods. The economic cost of the 9-hour blackout was estimated at hundreds of millions of dollars, and the 1989 storm, again, was substantially less powerful than the Carrington Event. The second major data point is the series of solar storms that occurred in October and November 2003, now commonly referred to as the Halloween storms. This period saw an extraordinary outburst of solar activity, including what were at the time the largest solar flares ever recorded. An X-28 class flare on November 4th, 2003, so large that it went off the scale of the standard measurement instruments, remains one of the most intense flares in recorded solar observation history. The Halloween storms affected 47 countries with power disruptions. In Sweden, a power outage affected more than 50,000 customers. But the most significant infrastructure damage occurred in South Africa, where 14 large high-voltage transformers were permanently destroyed by the geomagnetically induced currents from the storms. South Africa spent approximately 9 months and hundreds of millions of dollars dealing with the consequences of those transformer losses, facing constrained power capacity for well over a year after the event. The South Africa experience from 2003 is the best modern example of what transformer destruction means for the affected society. 14 transformers. South Africa, in 2003, was a middle-income country with a population of approximately 45 million people. The loss of 14 transformers caused significant economic disruption, rolling blackouts, and a constrained energy situation that lasted for years. Now extrapolate that to a scenario where 300 or more transformers are simultaneously destroyed across North America, in a society of approximately 350 million people, whose infrastructure is far more electricity dependent than South Africa's was in 2003. The third and perhaps most sobering modern data point does not involve an event that actually hit Earth. It involves one that missed. On July 23, 2012, a CME of extraordinary size and speed erupted from the Sun. The CME was fast, extremely fast, measuring a speed of over 3,000 kilometers per second by the time it passed through the region of space where Earth had been just 9 days earlier. It was measured in exquisite detail by NASA's Stereo A spacecraft, which happened to be positioned in Earth's orbit approximately 90 degrees around from Earth, and thus was directly exposed to the CM there rather than its passing at a distance. The measurements from Stereo A revealed a CME of remarkable properties. Its magnetic field was oriented southward, the orientation that causes maximum reconnection and maximum energy transfer to Earth's magnetosphere. Its density was high. Its speed was among the highest ever measured for a CME. And when the event was analysed by solar physicist Daniel Baker of the University of Colorado and other experts, their conclusion was sobering. If the Carrington CME had been intercepted by Stereo A rather than Earth in 1859, the readings would probably have looked similar to what Stereo A measured in 2012. This was, in the judgment of multiple independent scientists, a Carrington-class event. It missed Earth by 9 days. Earth had been in that location 9 days earlier. If the eruption had occurred 9 days later, or if Earth's orbital position had been slightly different, the July 2012 CME would have hit Earth directly. A 2014 study in the journal Nature Communications led by Pete Riley estimated, based on the distribution of known solar storms, that the probability of a Carrington-class event hitting Earth in any given decade is approximately 12%. Other estimates range from about 6% to about 16% per decade. These estimates suggest that we should, in a statistical sense, expect another Carrington-class event directed at Earth within the next 100 years or so, and possibly considerably sooner. We had one in 2012. It missed us by 9 days. The story of the Carrington event and its implications for modern civilization would be sobering enough if the Carrington event itself were the worst possible scenario. But it is not. The scientific record reveals that the Sun is capable of producing events substantially larger than what occurred in September 1859. And the most dramatic evidence for this comes not from a telescope or a magnetometer, but from an unusual source: tree rings. In 2012, a Japanese physicist named Fusa Miyake published a paper in the journal Nature that described an anomaly she had discovered in the isotopic composition of carbon preserved in the rings of ancient Japanese cedar trees. Specifically, she found a dramatic spike in the concentration of carbon-14, a radioactive isotope of carbon, in the rings corresponding to the years 774 and 775 of the Common Era. The spike was approximately 20 times larger than anything that could be explained by the normal variation in cosmic ray flux that produces carbon-14 continuously in Earth's atmosphere. Carbon-14 is produced in the upper atmosphere when cosmic rays, high-energy particles from outside the solar system, collide with nitrogen atoms. The carbon-14 then mixes into the atmosphere and is absorbed by all living things, including trees through photosynthesis. The amount of carbon-14 in a tree ring reflects the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere when that ring was formed. Under normal circumstances, the variation in carbon-14 from year to year is relatively small and reflects the gradual changes in cosmic ray flux over time. The 774 to 775 spike was not small and not gradual. It was abrupt and enormous. It appeared simultaneously in tree rings from Japan, Germany, the United States, New Zealand, and Russia, confirming it was a global atmospheric event. It appeared in ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica. It was real, and it was the largest such event identified in a detailed analysis of carbon-14 records spanning the past 3,000 years. What caused it? The debate among scientists has been spirited. Several possible mechanisms have been proposed. The most widely discussed is an extreme solar energetic particle event, a solar storm so powerful that it released an enormous burst of high-energy protons that flooded Earth's atmosphere and dramatically enhanced the production of carbon-14. An alternative explanation involves a gamma-ray burst from a distant stellar event, but geometric and timing constraints make this less likely. If the 774 event was indeed a solar energetic particle event, then its scale puts the Carrington event in a different perspective. The Carrington event, estimated from geomagnetic records, is clearly visible in ice cores as a nitrate spike. The 774 event is approximately 20 times larger than the Carrington event in terms of its cosmogenic isotope production. This does not necessarily translate linearly to a proportional increase in geomagnetic storm intensity, because the relationship between solar energetic particles and CME-driven geomagnetic activity is complex. But it strongly suggests that the Sun produced an event in 774 AD that was dramatically more powerful than anything in the modern instrumental record. If an event of the scale of 774 AD were to occur today, directed at Earth, the consequences would exceed even the scenarios we've been describing. A Carrington-scale event might destroy hundreds of large power transformers and leave portions of the developed world without power for months to years. A 774 scale event might be categorically more destructive, and 774 is not alone. Analysis of carbon-14 as beryllium-10 records from ice cores and tree rings reveals several events of similar or comparable magnitude scattered through the past few thousand years. In 993 AD, another anomalous carbon-14 spike appears in the tree ring record, smaller than 774, but still well above the Carrington level. Analysis extending further back in time reveals additional events. The Sun, over the course of its history, has produced extreme energetic events at irregular intervals. Some of these events may exceed the Carrington event by a factor of 10, 20 or more. We simply do not know the true upper limit of what the Sun can produce, because our instrumental record covers only approximately 150 years, which is a vanishingly small slice of the Sun's 11 billion year future lifetime. This is one of the most uncomfortable conclusions of modern space weather research. The Carrington event is not the worst case. It is simply the worst case we happen to have a detailed instrumental record of. The actual worst case, the upper bound of what solar activity can produce, is unknown. Let us now be explicit about the second call to action. Subscribe and leave a like if you have not already done so, and leave a comment telling me where in the world you are. I always read them. Now let us continue with the physical specifics of what a Carrington event damages and why. Let us go deeper into the specific technical vulnerabilities of modern infrastructure, because the details matter, and the details are more alarming than the general picture. Satellites. As of the mid-2020s, there are approximately 8,000 active satellites in orbit around Earth. These satellites provide services that modern civilization has become deeply dependent on: GPS navigation, telecommunications, weather forecasting, financial transactions, military communications, scientific research, and increasingly internet service to underserved areas. A severe geomagnetic storm threatens satellites through several mechanisms. The most immediate is radiation damage. High-energy particles from solar energetic particle events can damage the electronics of satellites, corrupting memory, degrading solar panels, and in extreme cases causing permanent failure. During the 2003 Halloween storms, several satellites experienced anomalies and a few suffered permanent damage. One Japanese weather satellite failed completely. The Midori 2 environmental monitoring satellite of the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency was lost during the Halloween storms. A second mechanism is orbital decay. During a severe geomagnetic storm, Earth's upper atmosphere is heated and expands outward due to the influx of energy. This expanded atmosphere increases the aerodynamic drag on satellites in low Earth orbit, which can cause rapid and unpredicted orbital decay. During intense storms, the atmospheric drag on low Earth orbit satellites can increase by a factor of 5 or more. Satellites may re-enter the atmosphere prematurely. In a Carrington scale event, the predicted orbital decay of satellites in low Earth orbit could be severe enough to threaten the survivability of many of the approximately 4,000 active satellites currently operating in low Earth orbit. The potential loss of GPS alone would be catastrophic in ways that are difficult to fully enumerate. GPS is not merely a navigation system for cars and hikers. It provides the precise timing signals that synchronize the global financial system, the Internet's packet routing infrastructure, the power grid's monitoring systems, and cellular phone networks. Virtually every modern infrastructure system uses GPS timing to coordinate its operations. The loss of GPS for an extended period would cascade into failures of systems that most people do not associate with navigation. The Internet itself is more vulnerable than most people realize. The backbone of the Internet consists of undersea fiber optic cables and terrestrial transmission infrastructure that is largely dependent on power at repeater stations along the cable routes. These repeater stations, spaced every 50 to 100 kilometers along cable routes, require continuous power to amplify and retransmit the optical signals. If power fails at repeater stations, the cable segments they serve stop transmitting. The Internet is robust to individual node failures because it can route around them, but widespread simultaneous failures along many cable routes could cause large portions of the Internet to become unreachable. Cloud computing infrastructure, which now hosts the operating systems of much of the world's commerce, government, healthcare, and communication, is concentrated in large data centers. Those data centers have backup power systems, typically diesel generators. The generators have fuel supplies. The fuel supplies last days to weeks under normal operations, potentially less under emergency high-load conditions. After the fuel runs out, without resupply, the data centers go offline. The data is not destroyed, assuming the storage systems are not directly damaged by the storm, but it becomes inaccessible. The applications running on the cloud cease to function. Nuclear power plants are a special concern during severe geomagnetic storms. Modern nuclear plants are designed to enter a safe shutdown state when external power is lost, but the cooling of the reactor core requires continuous power even after shutdown. Backup diesel generators supply this power. If those generators fail or run out of fuel, and if external power cannot be restored, the situation can progress toward the kind of overheating that occurred at Fukushima Daiichi in 2011 following the loss of external power from the tsunami. The United States has 92 operating nuclear reactors at 55 sites. All of them would face power challenges during an extended grid outage, and each would require prioritized fuel delivery for its backup generators. Pipelines present another specific vulnerability. The natural gas and petroleum pipelines that supply as energy to homes, businesses and industry are long conductors that would be subject to GICs during a geomagnetic storm. The GICs in pipelines cause accelerated electrochemical corrosion, which over extended periods can weaken the pipe walls and increase the risk of leaks and failures. The cathodic protection systems that normally prevent this corrosion are themselves powered by electricity. During an extended power outage, the pipelines would not only face corrosion from GICs, but would also lose their protective systems that normally prevent ambient corrosion. Beyond the physical vulnerabilities, there is the problem of cascade timing. Modern infrastructure systems are deeply interdependent in ways that create cascading failure sequences. The electrical grid goes down, then the fuel pumps at gas stations stop. Emergency vehicles cannot refuel. Water pumps stop, so water pressure falls. Without water pressure, fire suppression in buildings fails. Without functioning emergency vehicles and water pressure, fires in transformer oil at damaged substations cannot be controlled. Without communications, coordination of any response is degraded. Each failure makes other failures more likely, and the overall recovery more difficult. The interdependence creates what systems theorists call a robust yet fragile property. The modern grid is robust against the kinds of localized sequential failures that normal infrastructure management deals with. It is fragile against simultaneous, widespread, correlated failures, precisely the kind of failure that a geomagnetic storm produces. Let us talk about what the human experience of this kind of failure actually looks like, because the specific experiences of people who've lived through large-scale, extended power outages provide the best evidence for what a Carrington scale event would mean in human terms. Puerto Rico in 2017 provides the most recent and most instructive example. Hurricane Maria made landfall on September 20th, 2017 and knocked out power to nearly the entire island of approximately 3.5 million people. Approximately 3,000 people died in the aftermath of the storm, with the vast majority of those deaths attributed not to the storm itself, but to the cascading consequences of the extended power loss. Lack of access to medical care, contaminated water, equipment failures affecting vulnerable patients. Power was not fully restored to all areas for approximately 11 months. The specific ways people died in Puerto Rico after Maria are instructive for any scenario involving extended power loss. Dialysis patients, who require regular electrical dialysis treatments to survive, died when machines could not operate. People on home oxygen died. Elderly people in extreme heat without air conditioning died of heat stroke. People died from contaminated water sources when electric water treatment systems failed. Hospitals reduced to operating on minimal backup power could not provide normal levels of care, and people died from conditions that would have been survivable with normal medical support. Puerto Rico was a relatively small island with a population of 3.5 million people, and it received substantial external assistance. The mainland United States, which was not affected by the same hurricane, was able to provide aid, though the response has been widely criticized as inadequate. In a scenario where a geomagnetic storm simultaneously affects most of the North American continent or the entire developed world, there is no unaffected external region to provide aid. The 1998 ice storm that affected Quebec and New England is another instructive example. An ice storm that coated the region's electrical infrastructure in ice caused the loss of power to approximately 3 million people. for periods ranging from several days to over a month for the worst affected areas. In the areas without power for more than 2 weeks, which included some rural areas of Quebec and Ontario, the experience became genuinely survivalist. Communities that had been entirely dependent on electrical systems for heat, water, food storage and communications were forced to improvise with older technologies: wood-burning stoves, wells, preserved food. The communities that coped best were those with access to older infrastructure and skills that did not depend on electricity. The ice storm lasted weeks. A Carrington event could cause outages lasting months or years in the most affected regions, and the ice storm, severe as it was, did not affect the entire continent simultaneously, leaving substantial external resources available to support recovery. The specific population groups most vulnerable to extended power loss are those who depend on electricity to survive medically. In the United States, approximately 2.5 million people depend on electrically powered home medical equipment for survival, including home ventilators, oxygen concentrators, electric wheelchairs, infusion pumps, and suction machines. The approximately 450,000 Americans receiving regular dialysis would face a life-threatening crisis within days of their dialysis centers losing power. People with insulin-dependent diabetes would face a crisis, as insulin requires refrigeration to maintain its effectiveness, with most insulin formulations degrading within weeks at room temperature. Beyond the medically dependent population, the elderly are particularly vulnerable during extended power outages in extreme temperatures. The heat wave that killed approximately 15,000 people in France in August 2003, the majority of them elderly, demonstrated how quickly an extreme temperature event combined with loss of cooling infrastructure can become lethal for vulnerable populations. A summer Carrington event would combine power loss with heat. A winter event would combine power loss with cold. The question of what governments and societies have done to prepare for a Carrington-scale event is an important one, and the honest answer is some things, but probably not enough. Awareness of the threat from severe space weather has been growing among policymakers since at least the 1989 Quebec storm, but the 2008 report by the National Academy of Sciences titled Severe Space Weather Events. Understanding societal and economic impacts marked a turning point in the visibility of the issue. The report laid out in clear terms the potential consequences of a Carrington-scale event for modern infrastructure, and called for action to better understand and mitigate the risk. In 2016, the Obama administration issued an executive order on space weather events that directed federal agencies to develop plans for preparing for and responding to space weather events. The order led to the production of a space weather action plan that outlined specific steps to be taken to improve the nation's preparedness. Progress on implementing these steps has been variable. NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder, Colorado, operates continuously to monitor solar activity and forecast space weather events. The organization issues watches, warnings, and alerts for geomagnetic storms using a classification system similar to hurricane warnings. The Deep Space Climate Observatory, positioned at the Lagrange 1 point between Earth and the Sun, provides real-time measurements of the solar wind and incoming CMEs, giving approximately 15 to 60 minutes of warning before a severe event reaches Earth. This warning time, while better than nothing, is insufficient for most defensive actions other than alerting grid operators and satellite managers to prepare for anomalous conditions. Some utilities have implemented operational procedures that can reduce the risk to transformers during a geomagnetic storm warning. These procedures include reducing the reactive power loading on vulnerable transformers, reconfiguring the grid to reduce the length of transmission loops through which GICs can flow, and in some cases temporarily taking vulnerable transformers offline before the storm's arrival to prevent them from being damaged while energized. These measures can reduce but not eliminate the risk. A technology called geomagnetically induced current blocking or neutral grounding devices can be installed in transformer substations to prevent DC currents from flowing through transformer windings. These devices, which work by inserting a capacitor in the current path that blocks DC, while allowing AC to pass normally, are known to be effective. The cost per device is not prohibitive, typically in the range of hundreds of thousands to a few $1,000,000 per installation. But the number of transformers in the US that would require this protection numbers in the thousands, and the installation program has proceeded slowly. The proposed legislation in the US to address this issue, including various versions of bills with titles like the Secure High Voltage Infrastructure for Electricity from Lethal Damage Act, known by various acronyms, has been introduced and debated multiple times, but has not been comprehensively enacted. The regulatory framework for requiring grid hardening against geomagnetic storms is incomplete. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has issued standards that require grid operators to implement plans for space weather preparedness, but the stringency of these requirements and the pace of compliance has been criticized by researchers who study the threat. The UK, which has been somewhat more proactive on this issue, has explicitly classified severe space weather as a Tier 1 national security risk in its National Risk Register, placing it in the same category as a pandemic or a major industrial accident. The UK Space Agency and the Met Office jointly operate a space weather forecasting service that provides warnings to critical infrastructure operators. The UK has also invested in research to better understand the nation's specific vulnerability to geomagnetically induced currents, which is influenced by the local geology. The underlying challenge is that preparing for a Carrington-scale event requires making substantial upfront investments to protect against a risk that occurs at irregular intervals on a timescale of decades to centuries. Politicians and utility regulators operate on much shorter time horizons, typically 4 years for election cycles and annual for regulatory proceedings. The fundamental mismatch between the timescale of the risk and the timescale of political and regulatory decision-making makes adequate preparation difficult even when the risk is well understood. There is also the challenge that most people, including most decision-makers, have no intuitive sense of what a severe space weather event would actually mean. Unlike earthquakes or hurricanes or floods, which affect specific geographic areas and which most people in vulnerable regions have some experiential reference for, a severe geomagnetic storm is something that virtually no one alive today has directly experienced. The largest events in the modern era have caused significant but ultimately manageable disruptions. The Carrington Event itself, while dramatic by the standards of 1859, did not kill anyone or cause the kind of visible physical destruction that concentrates minds. It is very difficult to mobilize political will to prepare for a risk that is abstract, that has not occurred in living memory, and whose consequences are described in the language of complex technical systems. Let us go deeper into the specific physics of what happens when a geomagnetic storm hits the grid, because the specific mechanisms matter and the details are more alarming than the general picture suggests. A large high-voltage transformer is not like most electrical equipment. It is a massive, passive device that transfers electrical power between circuits through electromagnetic induction. At its heart are two sets of copper windings, the primary and the secondary, wound around a core of specialized steel laminations. The core provides a path for the magnetic flux that couples the two windings. The efficiency of this energy transfer depends critically on the magnetic properties of the core material remaining within their designed operating range. Under normal alternating current operation, the magnetic flux in the transformer core oscillates symmetrically with every cycle. The core operates well within its saturation limit, the point at which additional increases in magnetic field strength produce diminishing increases in flux. The designers of the transformer have specified core materials and winding geometries that ensure the core never reaches saturation during normal operation. When geomagnetically induced currents enter the transformer, they add a DC bias to the normal AC current in the transformer's neutral connection to ground. This DC bias shifts the operating point of the transformer's core. Instead of oscillating symmetrically around zero, the magnetic flux now oscillates asymmetrically, spending half of each AC cycle near the saturation limit and the other half well below it. During the half cycle, when the core approaches saturation, several bad things happen simultaneously. First, the transformer draws a large spike of reactive current from the grid every cycle. This reactive current does not perform useful work, but it loads the transmission lines and can cause voltage instability across large areas of the grid. When many transformers are simultaneously drawing large reactive current spikes due to GIC-induced saturation, the combined reactive load can overwhelm the grid's ability to maintain stable voltage. This is one of the mechanisms by which a geomagnetic storm can cause cascading grid failure, even without physically destroying any individual component. Second, the asymmetric flux creates harmonic distortion in the transformer's output. The transformer, instead of producing a clean 60 Hz alternating current, begins producing current containing harmonics at multiples of 60 Hz. These harmonics can interfere with protective relay systems, causing them to malfunction and either fail to operate when they should or operate falsely when they should not. The protection systems designed to keep the grid stable can be compromised by the same harmonic distortion the storm is causing. Third, and most critically for the long-term damage picture, the saturation-related heating. When the transformer core saturates, the electromagnetic energy that cannot be efficiently transferred to the secondary winding has to go somewhere. Much of it goes into heating. Specifically, it heats the transformer oil that cools the windings and the core, and it heats the structural steel components of the transformer tank that are normally outside the main magnetic circuit, but that carry significant flux during saturation. The heating of these structural components is not something transformers are designed to handle. The stray flux heating can damage insulation, warp structural elements, and cause hot spots in the transformer oil that can lead to the degradation and eventual failure of the insulating properties of the oil. The insulating oil is critical. A large high-voltage transformer operates with the primary and secondary windings immersed in highly refined mineral oil that provides both electrical insulation between windings, operating at different voltage levels, and thermal cooling through convection. If the oil degrades due to overheating, or if dissolved gases produced by oil decomposition build up to levels that trigger protection relays, the transformer must be taken offline. If the oil ignites, the transformer is destroyed. The specific damage mode that concerns engineers most is what is called thermal damage to the winding insulation. The copper windings of a large transformer are individually insulated with layers of cellulose paper that has been treated to improve its temperature resistance. This insulation can withstand temperatures up to a design maximum of approximately 100 degrees Celsius continuously, with short-term higher excursions permitted. If GIC-induced heating drives the insulation temperature significantly above this limit for extended periods, the insulation ages and degrades at an accelerated rate. What would normally be decades of useful insulation life can be consumed in hours or days. Once the insulation is compromised, the transformer becomes vulnerable to partial discharges and eventually to complete winding failures that require replacement of the entire unit. The specific problem from a recovery perspective is that this thermal damage may not manifest as an immediate catastrophic failure. The transformer may continue to operate in a degraded state for weeks or months after a severe geomagnetic storm before ultimately failing. This latent damage problem means that the true scope of storm damage to the transformer fleet may not be apparent for some time after the event, complicating recovery planning. The 1921 solar storm, sometimes called the New York Railroad storm, provides a historical example that illustrates both the vulnerability of electromagnetic infrastructure and how much more vulnerable modern infrastructure would be. On May 15, 1921, a geomagnetic storm struck Earth that many researchers consider to have been comparable in intensity to the Carrington Event, or at least to have been approximately 50 to 100% as strong. The storm occurred 62 years after the Carrington Event, during which time the electrical and electromagnetic infrastructure of the world had expanded enormously. The consequences were correspondingly more dramatic than the telegraph disruptions of 1859. In New York City, the switching tower of the Central New England Railway at Brewster caught fire and burned to the ground. The cause was currents induced in the long telegraph and telephone wires that connected the tower to the wider network. Telegraph offices across the eastern United States reported the same chaotic behavior that the Carrington Event had produced. In Sweden, the entire Swedish telegraph system was temporarily knocked out. In the UK, the Atlantic telegraph cables connecting Europe to North America were so severely disrupted that transatlantic communication was intermittent for hours. But the 1921 event occurred before the era of high-voltage electrical power transmission. The power grid as it exists today, with its thousands of kilometers of transmission lines operating at hundreds of thousands of volts, did not yet exist. The electrical infrastructure of 1921 was vulnerable enough to demonstrate that geomagnetic storms could damage modern systems. It was not yet developed to the point where a solar storm could threaten the power supply of entire nations. In the century since 1921, electrical infrastructure has expanded by orders of magnitude. The total length of high-voltage transmission lines in the United States alone exceeds 600,000 kilometers. The total transformer capacity of the US grid represents trillions of dollars of equipment that cannot be quickly replaced. The degree to which modern society depends on continuous electricity supply has increased from modest to absolute in the same century. The 1921 storm striking in 2024 would have been a major catastrophe. The Carrington Event striking in 2024 would be something larger. there is one aspect of the historical record that deserves particular attention. The 1972 solar storm. On August 4th, 1972, a severe solar storm struck Earth. This storm is not as widely known as the Carrington Event or the 1989 Quebec blackout, but it has a specific historical footnote that illustrates the military and geopolitical dimensions of severe space weather. During the Vietnam War, the United States Navy had deployed magnetic mines in the waters around North Vietnam. These mines were designed to detonate when they detected the magnetic signature of a passing ship. On August 4th, 1972, during the geomagnetic storm, the mines began detonating spontaneously. Dozens of mines exploded without any ships present, triggered by the fluctuating geomagnetic field produced by the storm. The event was classified for many years and only became publicly known through declassified documents. The 1972 storm also produced one of the largest solar proton events ever recorded, flooding Earth's polar regions with high-energy radiation. Aircraft flying polar routes were exposed to significant radiation doses. Astronauts in low Earth orbit, had any been present at the time, would have received potentially dangerous radiation doses. The military implications of severe space weather are not limited to accidental mine detonations. A severe geomagnetic storm would degrade or eliminate the GPS navigation and timing systems that modern military operations depend on. It would disrupt the satellite communications links used for command and control. It would interfere with the radar systems used for air defense and missile warning. It would compromise the underwater sonar systems used by submarines. A coordinated military operation attempting to exploit a naturally occurring geomagnetic storm as cover for an attack would find certain communication and surveillance systems degraded equally on both sides. While a country that had hardened its military infrastructure against geomagnetic effects would have a significant advantage. The interaction between space weather and military systems has been recognized by military planners, and there are classified programs in multiple countries aimed at hardening military infrastructure against space weather effects. But the general civilian infrastructure of most nations remains far less protected than military systems. There is a dimension of the Carrington Event story that is rarely discussed in technical analyses, but that becomes important when we think about the full implications of a modern recurrence. The psychological and social dimension. Modern societies have experienced large-scale infrastructure failures in specific geographic areas, and the documented behavioral response of affected populations provides some insight into how people respond to the sudden loss of essential services. The general finding from disaster research is that the immediate response of most people in most disasters is pro-social rather than anti-social. Communities tend to pull together, people share resources, neighbours help each other. The apocalyptic scenarios of looting and violence that feature in fictional disaster narratives are rarely the dominant pattern in real disasters. However, the research also shows that this cooperative tendency is time-limited. When an emergency lasts for hours or days, cooperative behaviour tends to dominate. When it lasts for weeks, the cooperative response begins to strain under the competing pressures of scarcity. When essential resources become genuinely unavailable for extended periods, the dynamics shift. The history of famines, sieges, and extended supply disruptions shows that social cohesion can deteriorate significantly when the basic necessities of survival are at stake. An extended power outage lasting months, in which water supply is interrupted, food distribution has failed, fuel is unavailable, and communications have ceased, would put social cooperation under stress of a kind that modern developed societies have not experienced within living memory. The specific vulnerability is not that people immediately become violent. It is that the institutional systems that normally maintain social order, the police forces, the emergency services, the judicial system, the communication systems that coordinate everything else, are themselves dependent on the power supply that has failed. Law enforcement agencies depend on electric communications. Courts and prisons depend on power. Supply chains for food and medicine depend on power. Every institution that maintains the normal functioning of society is, in the end, dependent on electricity. In an extended blackout, those institutions would be degraded and in some cases unable to function. The specific concern is what researchers call social cascading, where the failure of infrastructure cascades into the failure of the social institutions that depend on that infrastructure, which cascades into the failure of social order, which makes the restoration of infrastructure even more difficult because the organized human effort required to restore infrastructure requires functioning social institutions. This is not a prediction that a Carrington event would cause civilization to collapse. It is an observation that the longer a power outage lasts, the more difficult it becomes to restore power, because the restoration effort depends on exactly the kinds of organized, coordinated human activity that the outage is making harder to sustain. Let us also consider the international dimension. A severe geomagnetic storm is not constrained by national borders. A CME of Carrington scale, striking during a period when both North America and Europe are on the day side of Earth, could simultaneously affect both continents. If the storm is powerful enough, significant effects could be experienced across the entire hemisphere facing the sun. In this scenario, the recovery from the storm would not be a question of one country or region receiving assistance from others. It would be a question of multiple major economies simultaneously attempting to recover from the same event with degraded resources. The international trade in replacement equipment, the movement of crews and materials for grid restoration, the coordination of emergency food and medical supplies, all of these would be complicated by the fact that the manufacturing, logistics, and communication systems required for international assistance would also be affected. The economic interdependence of the modern world, which in normal circumstances is a source of stability and efficiency, becomes in this scenario a transmission mechanism for cascading failure. Just as the Bronze Age trading network that we explored in another video on this channel transmitted its collapse across the eastern Mediterranean in the 12th century BC, the interconnected modern global economy would transmit the consequences of a major space weather event across international boundaries. The specific bottleneck that most concerns grid analysts is the global supply chain for large power transformers. The largest high-voltage transformers are manufactured by a small number of factories in a small number of countries. In the aftermath of a global Carrington event, all affected countries would simultaneously be attempting to procure replacement transformers from the same limited manufacturing base. The manufacturing capacity that would normally produce these transformers over a period of years would be facing demand for years' worth of production in a compressed time frame, with the factories themselves potentially affected by the same power disruption that destroyed the transformers they are being asked to replace. The result would be a global scramble for a critical but severely limited resource, playing out against a background of degraded communications, disrupted finance, and constrained energy supply. This is exactly the kind of situation in which the normal mechanisms of international cooperation, the diplomatic channels, the trade agreements, the shared technical standards, become strained by the pressure of crisis. Now let's think about what has been learned from each storm we've experienced and what we should be doing differently. The most important lesson from the 1989 Quebec blackout is that the cascade can happen far faster than human operators can respond. 92 seconds from normal operation to complete blackout in a major interconnected grid is not enough time for human decision-making to prevent the failure. This points to the need for automated protection systems that can detect the specific signatures of GIC-induced saturation and take protective action automatically, without waiting for human operators to assess the situation and decide on a response. Several utilities have implemented systems that automatically reduce transformer loading or take protective actions when GIC levels exceed specified thresholds. The monitoring infrastructure required for these systems, including real-time measurement of GIC flows in transformer neutrals, has become more widespread. But the coverage is not universal, and the thresholds at which protective actions are triggered are calibrated based on experience with historical storms that are smaller than the Carrington Event. The lesson from the 2003 South Africa transformer losses is that the damage can be permanent, and that recovery from permanent transformer loss is extraordinarily slow. The South Africa experience has led some grid planners to take more seriously the concept of maintaining strategic reserves of critical high-voltage transformers that can be deployed rapidly to replace damaged units. The United States Department of Energy has promoted a program called Recovery Transformer, or RISI-X, which aims to develop standardized, rapidly deployable transformers that can serve as temporary replacements while permanent units are manufactured and installed. The lesson from the 2012 near miss is that we cannot rely on being lucky forever. The 2012 CME was of Carrington scale. It missed Earth by 9 days. This is not a large margin in the 4.5 billion year history of the solar system, or even in the 165-year history of documented space weather. The near miss should have produced a step change in the priority given to space weather preparedness. The extent to which it has done so is debatable. The lesson from the ice cores and the Miyake event is the most sobering of all. The Carrington event, which we have spent this entire discussion treating as the worst case against which we should prepare, is almost certainly not the actual worst case. The Sun has produced events substantially larger than the Carrington event within recorded history. If we're preparing only for a Carrington repetition and not for the possibility of a larger event, our preparation is inadequate against the true range of possible solar behavior. The standard for adequate preparation should not be withstanding the worst event we happen to know about. It should be withstanding the worst event the Sun can produce. We do not know precisely what that is, but the ice core and tree ring record gives us some guidance. The preparation required to protect the grid against a Miyake-scale event is more stringent than that required for a Carrington-scale event, but the fundamental technologies and approaches are the same. GIC blocking on vulnerable transformers, transformer reserves, automated protective systems, improved warning infrastructure, international coordination of response plans. The cost of this preparation, while not trivial, is orders of magnitude smaller than the cost of the event it is designed to prevent. The analysis is clear. The obstacle is not technical. It is political, institutional, and temporal. The challenge of acting now to prevent a disaster that might happen in 5 years or 50 years. There is an interesting parallel between the challenge of preparing for a Carrington event and the challenge of preparing for other long-time-scale, low-probability, high-consequence risks that modern civilization faces. Pandemic preparedness, climate change, asteroid defense. In each case, the risk is real and quantifiable. In each case, the cost of preparation is modest relative to the cost of the event. In each case, the political will to prepare is consistently outpaced by the urgency of shorter-term concerns. This is not a failure of intelligence or competence. It is a structural feature of how human decision-making systems work. We evolved to respond to immediate threats. We built political and institutional systems that respond to visible, urgent crises. Long-time-scale risks that materialize irregularly and whose consequences are distributed across many systems and many people are systematically underweighted by the heuristics and institutions we've built. The Carrington event is particularly interesting in this context because of its visibility. Unlike climate change, which operates on timescales that make its effects easy to discount, or pandemic risk, which is abstract until the pandemic arrives, a severe geomagnetic storm would manifest in a way that is immediately dramatically visible. The lights would go out, the phones would stop working, the water would stop flowing, the crisis would be immediate and unmistakable. The problem is that by the time the crisis is immediate and unmistakable, the time to prevent the worst consequences has already passed. The 15 to 45 minutes of warning from the DSC-OVR spacecraft is not enough time to retroactively install GIC blocking devices on thousands of transformers that were never protected. Preparation must happen before the storm, and preparation before a storm that may not arrive for decades requires exactly the kind of long-term institutional commitment that our decision-making systems are structurally poor at sustaining. What should an individual do with this information? This is a question that the discussion of severe space weather risks inevitably raises, and it deserves an honest answer rather than either dismissal or catastrophism. The honest answer is that individual preparation for a Carrington event, while not useless, is not the solution to the problem. The core vulnerability is systemic. It is the design of the grid and the absence of adequate protection for critical infrastructure. No amount of individual preparation changes that systemic vulnerability. At the same time, the knowledge that the grid is vulnerable to extended outage is useful information for individual and household resilience planning. Households that have a few weeks of food and water stored, that have alternative means of heating or cooling, that have battery-powered communications devices with stored knowledge, are more resilient to any extended outage scenario, not just space weather. The same preparations that make a household resilient to a severe winter storm, a prolonged heat wave, or a regional natural disaster provide some resilience against the early stages of a space weather event. At the community and civic level, the most productive response is engagement with the specific policy and regulatory decisions that determine how the electrical grid is protected, advocating for GIC blocking devices on critical transformers, supporting legislation that requires grid operators to take space weather preparedness seriously, demanding that emergency planning includes space weather scenarios alongside the more familiar disaster scenarios of earthquakes and hurricanes, At the national and international level, the response requires the kind of sustained institutional commitment that addressed the Y2K problem in the late 1990s. The Y2K problem, the concern that computer systems would malfunction at the transition from 1999 to 2000 due to a specific software design choice, was a known technical vulnerability with a fixed deadline. The international response, involving hundreds of billions of dollars of remediation work over several years, was successful. The transition occurred without catastrophic failure because the problem was taken seriously and addressed systematically. The space weather problem is analogous in some respects. It is a known technical vulnerability. It can be substantially mitigated through known technical measures. The cost of mitigation is quantifiable and manageable. The difference is that space weather does not have a fixed deadline. We cannot point to a specific date by which the problem must be fixed. That absence of urgency makes it easier to defer, and deferral is where the risk accumulates. The Carrington Event of 1859 was in one sense a gift. It demonstrated the reality and the scale of the threat at a time when our electromagnetic infrastructure was primitive enough that the consequences were manageable. It gave us the evidence we needed to understand what the sun can do. It gave us the time, more than 160 years and counting, to prepare before the next major event. Whether we use that gift well is still being decided. Let us spend more time with the specific scientific infrastructure that exists to monitor and warn about space weather, because understanding what we have and what we lack is essential to understanding the gap between where we are and where we need to be. The primary early warning system for Earth-directed CMEs is the Deep Space Climate Observatory, known as DSCOVR, a joint project of NOAA, NASA, and the United States Air Force, launched in February 2015. DSCOVR orbits at the Lagrange 1 point, a gravitational equilibrium point in the Earth-Sun system approximately 1.5 million kilometers from Earth in the direction of the Sun. At this location, DSCOVR sits in a gentle halo orbit that maintains a roughly fixed position in the rotating reference frame of the Earth-Sun system. The advantage of the Lagrange 1 position is that it lies directly upstream of Earth in the solar wind flow. Any solar wind or CME plasma that is travelling directly toward Earth must pass through the DSCOVR location before reaching Earth. DSCOVR's instruments measure the solar wind speed, density, temperature and magnetic field orientation in real time and transmit the measurements to NOAA's Space Weather Prediction Center in Boulder. When a large CME is approaching Earth, DSCOVR's measurements at the Lagrange 1 point provide the first in situ confirmation of the CME's properties. Based on these measurements, forecasters can estimate with high accuracy the arrival time at Earth and the likely severity of the resulting geomagnetic storm. The warning time from the moment DSCOVR detects the CME to the moment the CME hits. Earth's magnetosphere is determined by the distance between DSCOVR and Earth's magnetopause, approximately 1.5 million kilometers, divided by the CME's speed. For the fastest CMEs, those travelling at 3,000 kilometers per second or more, the warning time can be as short as 8 to 10 minutes. For more typical severe CME speeds of 1,000 to 1,500 kilometers per second, the warning time is approximately 15 to 25 minutes. For slow CMEs, the warning time can extend to an hour or more. This warning system is valuable. It provides confirmed data-based alerts when a storm is imminent, enabling grid operators and satellite managers to take last-minute protective actions. But its fundamental limitation is the geometry of its position. Because DS cover is only 1.5 million kilometers from Earth, it can only measure the CME's properties when the CME is nearly upon us. For operational purposes, there is very little time to act on the warning. To provide longer warning times, scientists have proposed positioning a magnetometer spacecraft much further upstream in the solar wind, potentially at distances of 5 to 30 million kilometers from Earth. At such distances, the warning time for even the fastest CMEs would extend to hours. This would be sufficient time for grid operators to take more substantial protective actions, including controlled reduction of transformer loading and the implementation of grid reconfiguration strategies that reduce the length of current loops through which GICs can flow. The technology for such a mission exists. The scientific case has been made. The cost would be modest by the standards of space exploration, estimated in the hundreds of millions to low billions of dollars. The mission has been discussed and proposed in various forms, but has not been funded and flown. It remains one of the most cost-effective space weather preparedness investments available, offering hours of warning time instead of minutes, for a cost that is a tiny fraction of the damage it would help prevent. Another gap in the monitoring infrastructure is the lack of continuous measurements of the Sun's activity from positions other than Earth's location in its orbit. The Sun is a sphere, and activity can occur on any part of its surface. When an active region capable of producing large CMEs is on the far side of the Sun from Earth, we have limited ability to observe it directly. A CME that erupts from the far side of the Sun will travel in the direction away from Earth and will not reach us, but if the active region rotates toward Earth-facing position over the following days, we may have little warning of its capabilities. NASA's STEREO mission, consisting of 2 spacecraft deployed into slightly different solar orbits to provide views of the Sun from perspectives ahead of and behind Earth in its orbit, provided invaluable data about the 3-dimensional structure of the solar corona and the propagation of CMEs. The Stereo B spacecraft was lost in 2016, leaving only Stereo A operational. The Stereo mission demonstrated the value of viewing the Sun from multiple vantage points and supported the case for a permanent multi-viewpoint solar monitoring capability. The European Space Agency's Solar Orbiter mission, launched in 2020, and NASA's Parker Solar Probe, launched in 2018, represent the current frontier of solar observation. Parker Solar Probe is making repeated close passes by the Sun, passing through the corona itself and making measurements of solar wind properties at distances as close as approximately 10 solar radii from the solar surface. These missions are advancing our fundamental understanding of how the Sun generates solar wind and launches CMEs. That scientific understanding will ultimately improve the accuracy of space weather forecasts. But there remains a significant gap between scientific understanding and operational forecasting capability. Current space weather forecasts can predict the timing of CME arrivals at Earth with accuracy measured in hours. They can predict storm intensities with useful but imperfect accuracy. The critical parameter that most affects storm severity, the orientation of the CME's magnetic field, and specifically whether it will be predominantly northward or southward when it reaches Earth, cannot currently be predicted reliably from observations taken while the CME is still near the Sun. This parameter typically can only be measured with high accuracy when the CME reaches DSCOVR, providing the 15 to 45 minutes of warning already discussed. improving the ability to forecast CME magnetic field orientation from observations made days before the CME arrives would be transformative for space weather preparedness. Research toward this goal is active and ongoing, but it remains one of the fundamental unsolved problems in space weather science. Let us examine in detail what the 48 hours following a Carrington scale CME impact would look like for those responsible for managing the response. Because the response in those first 48 hours determines the trajectory of recovery or collapse. At T+0, the CME hits Earth's magnetosphere. Magnetic reconnection begins on the sunward side of the magnetosphere. The first signature is a sudden impulse, a rapid change in Earth's magnetic field detectable at magnetic observatories worldwide. Geomagnetically induced currents begin flowing in long conductors within minutes. Grid operators who have received the DSC-OVR warning have had 15 to 45 minutes to prepare. Some have reduced loading on vulnerable transformers. Some have implemented protective operational procedures. But many transformer substations across the affected area are still operating normally, and the GICs beginning to flow through their neutral connections are not yet causing obvious problems. At T+15 minutes, the storm intensifies. The KP index is rising rapidly. Grid operators are seeing unusual reactive power flows. Some protection relays have already tripped, isolating portions of the grid. The cascade is beginning in the most vulnerable areas. At some substations, transformer protective systems are responding to the anomalous currents by taking the transformers offline. The grid is beginning to shed load. At T+30 minutes, significant portions of the northeastern United States, southeastern Canada, and northern Europe are experiencing power outages as the cascade progresses. Emergency operations centers are activating. The President and Prime Ministers are receiving briefings. Utilities are attempting to manage the cascade by manually shedding load and reconfiguring distribution circuits. But the scale of the event is exceeding the ability of these measures to contain. At T+1 hour, the storm is at or near its peak intensity. Transformers in multiple substations are experiencing severe GIC flows. Some are overheating. Several have already failed with fire. The smell of burning transformer oil is detectable downwind of multiple substations. Emergency services are responding to transformer fires, but are overwhelmed by the number of simultaneous incidents. At T+2 hours, the storm begins to moderate from its initial peak, but remains extremely severe. Much of the affected region is now without power. The cascade has run to completion in most areas. Utility operators are attempting to assess damage and begin restoration. Satellite operators are reporting anomalies and failures across multiple spacecraft. GPS performance is degraded. At T+6 hours, the immediate storm has passed its peak, but the geomagnetic disturbance continues at elevated levels. Utilities are beginning damage assessments. The results are grim. A significant number of transformers have been permanently damaged. The subset of these that can be restored to service through repair is being identified. The remaining damaged transformers require replacement. At T+24 hours, the scale of the disaster is becoming clear. Hundreds of millions of people are without power. Water pressure in most urban areas is falling. Hospitals are operating on generator power. Cell phone service is degraded as battery backups at towers are depleted. Emergency fuel supplies are being allocated to critical facilities. The food distribution system is essentially stopped. At T+72 hours, the immediate emergency is giving way to the sustained crisis. Most cell towers have lost power. The internet is inaccessible over most of the affected area. ATMs and payment systems are offline. Fuel is unavailable at most gas stations. Water pressure has failed in most areas. Hospitals are making difficult decisions about which generators to prioritise. Food spoilage is widespread. Emergency distributions of food and water are being organised but are constrained by fuel availability and the collapse of the logistics systems that would normally coordinate them. The critical decision point arrives somewhere in the first 2 weeks. The question of how long the power will be out depends fundamentally on how many transformers were permanently destroyed. If the number is in the dozens, recovery within weeks to a few months is possible. If the number is in the hundreds, recovery within months to a year or more is likely. If the number is in the high hundreds to thousands, recovery on any reasonable timeline becomes extremely difficult. The transformer manufacturing and replacement question is the pivotal one. In the aftermath of a severe event, the first question utility executives will be asking is how many spare transformers are available for immediate deployment. The number of large high-voltage transformers maintained in strategic reserve by US utilities is estimated at approximately a few dozen, far fewer than would be needed in a major event. The number that could be borrowed or redirected from utilities in unaffected areas is limited by the fact that in a global event there may be few unaffected areas. The manufacturing ramp-up that would eventually produce replacement transformers cannot begin immediately. The factories that make large power transformers require power themselves to operate. They require steel, copper, specialty oil and other inputs whose supply chains have been disrupted. They require workforces who may themselves be dealing with the consequences of the power outage. The lead time of 12 to 18 months under normal conditions is a lower bound. Under post-storm conditions, it could be substantially longer. The recovery trajectory in a major storm scenario would likely look something like this. In the weeks immediately following the storm, emergency power is restored to the most critical facilities using generators and temporary distribution arrangements. Hospitals, water treatment plants, and communications facilities are prioritized. The broader population remains without power. Over the following months, the most damaged transformers are either repaired or replaced with units from whatever inventory is available. Some grid sections are restored as units become available. Others remain dark. The recovery is patchy and uneven, with some areas recovering relatively quickly, and others remaining without power for extended periods. Over the following years, manufacturing capacity worldwide ramps up to produce the replacement transformers needed to fully restore the damaged grid sections. The economic cost of the outage and the recovery compounds over this period as the disruption to economic activity continues. The social and political consequences of the extended crisis change the landscape of the affected societies in ways that persist long after the lights come back on. There is one more element of the Carrington Event story that belongs in any complete discussion. The specific chemistry of the solar corona and what it tells us about the probability and character of extreme events. The sun's corona, the outermost layer of the solar atmosphere, is one of the great mysteries of astrophysics. Despite being further from the sun's energy-producing core than the photosphere, the corona is dramatically hotter. The photosphere has a temperature of approximately 5,800 degrees Kelvin. The corona has a temperature of 1 to 3 million degrees Kelvin. This temperature inversion, the corona being several hundred times hotter than the surface below it, is known as the coronal heating problem and has not been fully resolved despite decades of research. The corona is also the source of the solar wind, the continuous stream of electrons, protons, and heavier ions that flows outward from the Sun in all directions. And the corona is where CMEs originate. When the magnetic fields in the corona become sufficiently twisted and energetically stressed by the convection of the underlying photosphere, they can suddenly reorganize in a process called magnetic reconnection that releases an enormous quantity of stored magnetic energy in a very short time. This energy goes into accelerating plasma to high velocities, producing the intense radiation of a solar flare and driving the CME outward through the corona into the solar wind. The energy available in the corona's magnetic field is not unlimited, but it is enormous. Active regions on the Sun can contain magnetic field strengths of thousands of Gauss over areas of tens of billions of square kilometers, and the total energy stored in these fields can be comparable to millions of nuclear weapons. The fraction of this energy that is released in a single CME event determines the severity of the event. The largest flares ever directly measured, using the Gauss satellite fleet that has been monitoring solar X-ray output since the early 1970s, have been X-class flares in the range of X10 to X28 or greater. The November 2003 flare that went off scale is estimated to have been approximately X45, possibly more. The relationship between flare energy and CME energy is complex and not strictly proportional, but the largest flares tend to be associated with the most energetic CMEs. Can the Sun produce events dramatically larger than the strongest flares we have measured? The answer from the carbon-14 record is yes. The 774 AD Miyake event required an energetic particle flux at Earth, approximately 20 times larger than what even the strongest historically recorded solar events could produce through normal mechanisms. If the Miyake event was indeed a solar energetic particle event, the Sun produced something in 774 AD that is well outside the range of what we have measured directly in the approximately 50 years of detailed space weather observation. Stars similar to the Sun have been observed to produce superflares, flares thousands of times more energetic than the largest solar flares ever recorded. The frequency of superflares on Sun-like stars decreases as the stars age and their rotation rates slow, and the Sun at its current age and rotation rate is less likely to produce a superflare than younger solar-like stars. But the probability is not zero. The practical implication is that in thinking about extreme space weather preparedness, we should not anchor our thinking exclusively on the Carrington event as the worst case. The Carrington event is the best documented extreme event we have. The Miyake event of 774 AD suggests the Sun has produced substantially more powerful events within the past few thousand years. The superflare observations of other Sun-like stars suggest that the upper limit of solar activity is higher still. Our preparation should acknowledge the range of possibilities rather than treating the Carrington event as the definitive maximum. The question of whether the Sun could produce an event in the future that would exceed even the Miyake event is one that space weather scientists take seriously. The observational evidence from other stars shows that superflares, while rare on old slow-rotating Sun-like stars, do occur. A solar superflare would be accompanied by a CME of proportionally enormous energy and would produce geomagnetic effects dwarfing anything in the instrumental or ice core record. If the Carrington event would knock out the power grid for months to years, a superflare CME directed at Earth would be an event of existential magnitude for technological civilization. The specific question of whether such an event could strip away Earth's atmosphere or cause direct biological harm through radiation is more nuanced. Earth's magnetic field and atmosphere provide substantial protection against even very large energetic particle events. The biological threat from solar radiation, even during extreme events, is real, but primarily confined to people in space, at high altitudes, or in polar regions, where shielding from the atmosphere and magnetic field is reduced. The catastrophe of a superflare event for modern civilization would not be primarily biological. It would be civilizational in the same way that a Carrington event would be civilizational, but larger in every dimension. Every electromagnetic system on Earth simultaneously and catastrophically disrupted. The electrical grid of the entire technologically dependent world damaged beyond rapid repair. Communication systems worldwide failing simultaneously. Every satellite in orbit either destroyed or severely damaged. Recovery from such an event, if it occurred today, would require rebuilding the electromagnetic infrastructure of civilization essentially from scratch, using the surviving industrial capacity of the less affected parts of the world over a period that would likely be measured in decades rather than years. Whether the social and political fabric of modern civilization could survive an infrastructure crisis of that magnitude and duration is genuinely uncertain. This is not presented as a prediction or even as a likely scenario. The probability of a superflare from the Sun in any given century is very low, but the probability is not zero, and the consequences are sufficiently catastrophic that even very low probabilities demand acknowledgement and serious consideration. The Drake equation, which attempts to estimate the probability of intelligent communicating civilizations existing elsewhere in the galaxy, includes a term for the longevity of technological civilizations. How long, on average, do civilizations that develop electromagnetic technology survive? One contribution to this term might be the vulnerability of electromagnetic civilizations to extreme space weather events from their host star. A civilization that builds its infrastructure on electromagnetic systems and fails to adequately protect that infrastructure against the full range of its star's possible behavior might not survive long enough to communicate with others. This is speculative, and the Fermi paradox has many possible explanations. But it adds a cosmic dimension to the very practical question of whether we will invest adequately in protecting our electrical grid from a solar storm that could come any year, or might not come for a century. The Carrington event gave us evidence of the threat. The Miyake event gave us evidence that the threat is larger than the Carrington event alone suggests. The observations of superflares on other stars give us evidence that the upper bound of the threat is larger still. We are living on a planet orbiting a star. That star has a specific personality, a specific pattern of behavior that includes periodic eruptions of magnetic energy that interact with Earth's electromagnetic systems. We have known about this since 1859. We have been building our entire civilization on electromagnetic infrastructure since approximately the same time. The Carrington event is the sun introducing itself. It was showing us, in a language we could almost afford to ignore in 1859, what it is capable of and what it will do again. Whether we have been paying attention is the question that the next major geomagnetic storm will answer. There is one more thread that must be followed to its conclusion: the relationship between space weather and the specific form of modern globalization we have built. The 20th century saw the construction of an electrical infrastructure that, within approximately 100 years, went from non-existent to absolutely essential. The telegraph, that was the most advanced electromagnetic system at the time of the Carrington Event, was replaced by the telephone, which was replaced by radio, which was joined by television, which gave way to satellite communications, which preceded the internet, which is now the backbone of essentially everything. Each successive layer of electromagnetic infrastructure was built on top of the previous ones, creating a stacked system of dependencies that reaches from the satellite networks in geostationary orbit, through the undersea cables on the ocean floor, to the smart meters in individual homes. The remarkable fact about this infrastructure is how recently it was built. An American born in 1850 would have experienced the Carrington Event as a dramatic disruption of the telegraph network. Their grandchildren born in 1880 would have electricity in their homes by 1900. Their great-grandchildren would have radio, then television, then computers. Their great-great-grandchildren, born around 1950, would see the internet emerge in their lifetimes, become universal by middle age, and by the time they are elderly would live in a world where electricity is as fundamental to survival as water. This is an extraordinary transformation accomplished in approximately 4 generations, and the specific vulnerability it has created, the dependence of water and food and medicine and communication and finance and governance on a continuous supply of electricity, is less than 100 years old. The human species survived for several 100,000 years before electricity. The specific form of modern civilization we've built, in which electricity is the prerequisite for everything else, is extraordinarily new. This newness is relevant to the Carrington Event discussion for a specific reason. The threat the sun poses to electrical infrastructure is not a new threat. The sun has been producing Carrington-scale events throughout the entire history of the Earth. But the vulnerability to that threat, the existence of an electromagnetic infrastructure that a geomagnetic storm could destroy, is new. We created the vulnerability by building the infrastructure, and we created the vulnerability faster than we have yet managed to protect against it. This is not unique to space weather. It is a pattern that appears repeatedly in the history of technology. New capabilities create new vulnerabilities. The automobile gave us the ability to travel at speed and created the vulnerability of traffic accidents. The nuclear reactor gave us enormous energy, generation capacity, and created the vulnerability of nuclear accidents and nuclear weapons. The internet gave us global instant communication and created the vulnerability of cyber attacks and information warfare. The electrical grid gave us universal access to power and created the vulnerability to geomagnetic storms. In each case, the appropriate response is not to abandon the technology, but to invest adequately in understanding and mitigating the specific vulnerability it creates. We developed seat belts and traffic laws and crash standards for automobiles. We developed containment structures and safety systems and international safeguards for nuclear technology. We are, imperfectly and incompletely, developing cybersecurity practices and norms for the internet. For the electrical grid and space weather, the mitigation technologies exist. They are understood. They are being implemented slowly and incompletely in some places. What has not yet happened is the kind of sustained, systematic, adequately funded program of grid hardening that would substantially reduce the worst outcomes of a Carrington-scale event. The comparison that space weather researchers often make is to flood control. Floods happen. They always have happened. No one can prevent a severe storm from producing high water, but societies throughout history have built infrastructure to manage flood risk. Levees, drainage systems, floodplain management, early warning systems. The existence of flood control infrastructure does not eliminate floods, but it dramatically reduces the damage when floods occur. The same approach is available for geomagnetic storms. The GIC blocking devices are the levees, the transformer reserves are the sandbags, the warning systems are the weather forecasts. We know how to build flood control. We know how to build space weather resilience. The question is whether we will. The specific moment in which we find ourselves as of the mid-2020s is worth characterizing precisely. The solar cycle that began in December 2019, solar cycle 25, has been more active than forecast. The activity has been higher than predicted by most models, and solar maximum for this cycle is expected to occur in the 2024 to 2025 timeframe based on current activity trends. A higher than expected solar maximum means a higher than normal probability of extreme events during that period. The relationship between solar maximum and extreme space weather events is not deterministic. The most extreme historical events have not always occurred at solar maximum. The 1859 Carrington Event occurred near solar maximum, but the 1921 storm occurred during a declining phase of the solar cycle. The 2003 Halloween storms occurred during the declining phase of solar cycle 23. Extreme events can occur at any point in the solar cycle, though the probability is highest near maximum. What this means in practical terms is that the period of highest space weather risk is not a distant future scenario. It is now. The solar cycle that the world is currently in, with a maximum that coincided with or has just passed the most comprehensive deployment of space weather monitoring ever assembled, combined with the most electricity-dependent civilization in the history of Earth, represents the specific intersection of maximum risk and maximum vulnerability that makes the Carrington Event question urgent rather than theoretical. The warning infrastructure is better than it has ever been. The grid hardening, while incomplete, has made progress. The awareness of the risk among grid operators and policymakers is higher than at any previous point, and the sun is at or near the most active phase of its current cycle. We are in the window. The question that the next few years will answer, one way or another, is whether the preparation we have done is adequate. The sun does not know or care that our civilization has made itself dependent on electromagnetic systems. It does not moderate its activity because of our satellites or our power grids. It has been producing energetic events for 4.5 billion years, and will continue to do so for approximately another 5 billion years. The 11-year cycle continues regardless of our preparedness. Solar maximum arrives and departs on its own schedule. CMAs erupt in all directions, and some of them will be aimed at Earth. The probability estimates for a Carrington scale event directed at Earth range from approximately 1% per year to approximately 1.5% per year in the most cited studies, with some studies suggesting somewhat higher or lower probabilities. 1% per year sounds small, but consider the timescales involved. Over the approximately 165 years since the Carrington event, the probability of experiencing another Carrington scale event, assuming a 1% annual probability, is approximately 1 minus 0.99 to the power of 165, which equals approximately 81%. In other words, if 1% per year is the correct probability, We've been statistically overdue for another Carrington event for most of the period since the original occurred. We've been lucky. We had the 1989 Quebec storm, which was a serious but manageable event. We had the 2003 Halloween storms, which damaged infrastructure in South Africa and caused satellite problems but did not produce a Carrington-level geomagnetic storm. And we had the 2012 near miss, a Carrington-scale CME that passed through the region of Earth's orbit 9 days after Earth had left that position. Our luck may not hold indefinitely. The statistics suggest it will eventually run out. The question that the Carrington event poses for the 21st century is not whether another severe space weather event will occur. The question is whether, when it does occur, we will have done enough to limit the damage to something our civilization can absorb and recover from within a reasonable time frame. The honest answer to that question, as of the present moment, is that we probably have not. The electrical grid of the United States and of most of the developed world remain substantially vulnerable to a Carrington-scale geomagnetic storm. The cost of meaningful hardening of the grid, including the installation of GIC blocking devices on vulnerable transformers and the stockpiling of replacement transformers, has been estimated at between $1 billion and $2 billion for the United States alone. This sounds like a large number, but a 2008 National Academy of Sciences study estimated the economic damage from a Carrington-scale event at between $1 trillion and $2 trillion in the first year alone, with ongoing costs throughout the multi-year recovery period. The cost-benefit calculation for preparing is not even close. The preparation costs would be hundreds to thousands of times less than the damage cost of an unprepared event. The reason preparation has not been comprehensively undertaken is not economic rationality. It is the specific structure of how we make decisions about long-term, low-probability, high-consequence risks. We systematically underinvest in preparing for risks that have not occurred recently, that are not visible in our immediate experience, and whose consequences are diffuse and distributed across many different systems, rather than concentrated in a single visible catastrophe. This is the same structural failure that leaves coastlines inadequately protected against rare but predictable storms, that leaves disease surveillance systems underfunded until the next pandemic, and that allows the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere to rise for decades before meaningful collective action is taken. It is the failure of planning against a future we have not yet experienced. Let us close by thinking carefully about what Richard Carrington saw on that September morning in 1859 and what it means for us. Carrington was a careful scientist operating at the frontier of knowledge about a phenomenon that was poorly understood. He did not know that what he was watching was a solar flare, because the concept did not yet exist. He did not know that what had erupted from the sunspot group would be a cloud of magnetized plasma traveling toward Earth at millions of kilometers per hour. He could not have imagined that the telegraph systems of the world would go haywire the following night, powered by currents from the sun itself. What he saw was a brief flash of extraordinary white light on the sun's surface. 5 minutes, and then it was gone. The world he lived in was insulated from the worst consequences of what had happened by the primitive state of its technology. There were no power grids to destroy. There were no satellites to damage. There were no microprocessors to fry. The telegraph operators got some shocks, wrote some fascinating letters, and the world moved on. The world we live in is not similarly insulated. Every system that makes modern life possible, every system that keeps people alive, Every system through which we communicate and cooperate and coordinate and build everything we have built runs on electricity. And electricity is vulnerable to the sun. This is not a new vulnerability. The sun has been producing Carrington-scale events throughout the history of our species, throughout the history of our civilizations, throughout the entire period during which humans built the world we inhabit. The 1859 event happened. The 1921 New York Railroad storm happened. The 774 AD Miyake event happened. These events are not hypothetical. They are historical facts. The difference between then and now is not that the sun is more dangerous. The difference is that we have made ourselves more vulnerable. The specific act of building our civilization on an electromagnetic foundation, of making electricity the prerequisite for water and food and communication and medicine and finance and everything else, has created a specific vulnerability to the specific thing that the sun has been producing for 4.5 billion years. We created this vulnerability within approximately 150 years. We are aware of it. We can measure it. We can calculate its consequences. We can mitigate it, not eliminate it, but substantially reduce it. The question is whether we will. The Carrington Event of 1859 was nature demonstrating its capacity. The July 2012 near miss was nature demonstrating that the capacity is still there, that the specific combination of factors that produce the original Carrington event can and will recur. The specific outcome of the next Carrington event, whether it is the manageable disruption of a prepared civilization or the existential crisis of an unprepared one, depends on choices that are available to us right now. The sun does not warn us. It does not schedule its events for convenient times. It erupts when the physics of its magnetic field demands, and what emerges travels toward us in the time that it takes, and arrives when it arrives. The 15 to 45 minutes of warning from the Dieskova spacecraft is not enough to protect an unprepared grid. It is enough to protect a prepared one. We know what Carrington saw. We know what it means. We know what to do. The only remaining question is whether we do it before the next flash appears on the solar disk and the clock starts running. Let it rest around you as you settle towards sleep. The sun above, 330,000 times the mass of the Earth, 4.5 billion years old, burning hydrogen to helium in its core at rates that human mathematics can express but human imagination cannot fully hold. Its surface churning continuously, magnetic fields threading through the plasma in patterns of extraordinary complexity, building toward the next eruption the way a fault builds toward an earthquake, the way pressure builds toward release. The Carrington event was not an anomaly. It was not an exceptional deviation from the sun's normal behavior. It was a normal expression of the sun being the sun, doing what it has always done, what it will always do. The anomaly is not the sun. The anomaly is us. The electromagnetic civilization we built in 150 years, resting on a foundation of electrical infrastructure stretched across continents, reaching into space with thousands of satellites, touching every aspect of every life in the developed world. The sun does not know we are here. It does not know about our transformers or our satellites or our data centers. It processes its magnetic energy on its own schedule, on its own time scale, according to its own physics. And every now and then, for just a few minutes, something extraordinary flashes on its surface, white and brilliant and gone before you can call someone to witness it. and then the counting begins. Sleep well.